Hello, Roll20. I would like to highlight a bug about using single quotes and double quotes as values for the default sheet settings and some of the quirky things that happens when you do so. For the single quotes, I've added 5 different tests, and for the double quotes, I've added 2 sets of 4, so 8 tests in total. My original problem was that I needed to add a value like this, a single quote in a value, and that broke down. And in order to figure out why, I investigated different setups. I cannot escape a single quote because that breaks the JSON format, and I cannot change the format to wrapping in single quotes, and then escaping this one because that also breaks the format. So we will see what happens when you use a single quote in the value, when you try to escape it, in this case by double escape, when you try to encode it in HTML, and also what happens when you try to double encode it, and finally if you try to use Unicode. The same is done for the double quotes. We try to escape it, we try to encode it, we try to double encode it, and we try to use Unicode. And then we do the same thing again for double quotes. And I'll get into that once we get into the sheet. But again, escaped, encoded, double encoded, and Unicode. First of all, whenever we try to save these values, we will see that it is not reflected on the default sheet settings if these are saved. As you can see here, only the Unicodes for the single quotes are saved, and this double quote escaped, and the double quote escaped second one has been saved, and also the Unicode. Inspecting the code here, we can see some of the things that happens. We can see that the value of the checkbox has been changed to quote, and everything after the single quote has been dropped. If we check the escaped value, we can confirm this. As you can see, it says quote backslash, and then the backslash quote has been dropped. If we check the encoded version, we can see the value is actually here as we expect. And if we check the double encoded version, we can see that it has been decoded once. So the ampersand has been decoded, but the single quote has not been decoded yet. And for the Unicode example, it is just exactly as we expect it to, as there are no quotes in this string, there is a plus, and it is handled correctly. The same can be seen for the double quote characters, that the double quote here is actually set correctly here as we expected. So that is why it's also checked. And when we check the other one here, it is also set as we expected, but it is not reflected because this is encoded. For the double encoded, it is also been decoded once, so somewhat as expected, and the Unicode character exactly the same as before. So that works as expected. Jumping into the sheet, we will see that the values are actually set, but they have different values than we expect them to. So I will make a new character here. We can see all the values has been initialized, and when I click save here, we can see all the values has been set. Going into the character sheet, we can see that only some of the values has been set. Here we can see what the checkboxes in the code when I wrote the code in my editor was expecting. So I was expecting the checkbox to say, you should take a quote and then the quote string and then a single quote and then string value. But once we start inspecting these checkboxes, we can see that they have been set up as expected. So that is good. But despite this one here, the single encoded case not being reflected on the default sheet settings, it has actually been set on the character sheet, which is good. When we go down to the double quote test, I have used this format here, and this is not proper HTML. as I have been wrapping my value in a single quote here and adding a double quote in the middle, and it has given some funny results. We can see that again, the double quote here for the HTML has been handled in such a way that it expects the value here to be just the word quote. So that is the reason why all of these examples don't work. It is not proper HTML. Going down to more proper HTML, I have used double quotes, but I have encoded the quote for the checkboxes. And as we can see, when we inspect, the value here has been is correct. It has the word quote and then a double quote and then the word value. And it works both for the escape character and for the quote character. Recalling from the default sheet settings, this one was also the one that actually worked. So at least for double quotes, it can be handled by encoding the HTML and escaping the value, and then it will reflect correctly both on the default sheet settings and on the character sheet. So far, so good. One workaround that works. Then the next one here again has the correct value for the checkbox, but it isn't reflected, which is a bit odd, but it's the same as up here. Going into the attributes, we can take a look at what's actually being set. I'll just remove this to create a bit more space. Here we can see that the single quotes has been cut off, just like we saw on the sheet on the default sheet settings. They have been cut off, so the values being set is reflective of what is seen on the default sheet settings, but it's not what we expected to happen. Going down here, we can see that both the single encoded case and the double encoded case seems like they have the same value, but are not reflected out here, despite having the same value. But for some reason, if I go in here and click this, and then unclick it, go out again, then it has suddenly been updated. So it has the right value, it just doesn't know it has the right value. So there might be some with the updating of the character sheet according to the value that are mishandled in this case. And the Unicode characters, not that interesting because they fail every time because they do not set what we expect them to. Or rather, they set exactly what we expect them to, but it isn't changed to any character, the Unicode. The double quotes, first examples here, all of them are incorrect. Again, the improper HTML causes the expected value to just be the name quote, and that is why all these values, which seems to be correct, are not, or at least are not reflected. Going down to the case 5, 6, 7, and 8, where the expected values are the word quote, then the double quote, and the word value, we can see that the first two cases have the correct value and are also correctly reflected on the sheet. And just like with the single quote with the double encoding, here the double encoding does not seem to be reflected, even though the value here for the double encoding is correct. But if I click it and click out, then it is added here. So that's good. And finally, we have the Unicode that is set just like this and therefore isn't reflected. But again, that is expected behavior. So the biggest problem with all of this is basically this one. As it is when you write the Sheet.json, this is valid JSON, but it is not reflected when you update the value on the Sheet.json, and also the value on the Sheet.json does not show that. So going back, we can see it here, the single quote example. Yeah, the value here is quote, and we can actually even see that the string has been ended and then the remainder has been added here as the word value standing by itself. So yeah, it is pretty clear that the single quotes, it isn't handled correctly. And it would be very nice if that would get fixed because it really should work with a single quote. I hope this will get looked at, and hopefully at least just the single quote case will get fixed soon. And as these double quote cases, I really don't think are relevant because the most basic case works as expected, and I assume most people would go with that approach, and that works both here and on the sheet. The workaround to use the escaped is not really workable because it isn't reflected on the default sheet settings. So even though it might work on the character sheet, it does not work here on the sheet settings. So a dungeon master cannot, or a game master cannot see that it has been set correctly. So yeah, I hope this will get looked at, and thank you for listening to my rambling.